minutes, and then we will open it up to questions and discussion so that Gillian and I aren't sort of really distracted by the chat during her session. Please could you message your questions to Teresa, who is in my left-hand corner, not sure about you, and she will coordinate them and send them through to me so that I can ask them at the end. So any questions, please send them through to Teresa. And welcome, whether you are a new member of the community or you've been here for ages. It's absolutely lovely to see you all, and great to see faces on screen. So I am delighted to welcome Gillian, who has come to talk to us today about the art of resolving conflict mindfully, which is a bit of a massive topic. But Gillian's background is she is an international barrister who has worked in war crimes tribunals. She has worked on cases of genocide, crimes against humanity, the trial of a former head of state. She's also a civil and commercial mediator, so has a vast array of experience in managing conflict within her professional life. And Jill may say more about her journey into mindfulness, but I know, having spoken to Gillian, that her route into it really stemmed from having been exposed to a lot of stressful evidence in her role as a barrister, but also when she adopted her 3-year-old daughter, she found mindfulness practice very, very useful in helping the adoption process. And I'm sure that having a child and doing homeschooling during lockdown also made her fully even more equipped in managing conflicts. So managing conflict at mindfulness and at home. Gillian trained to be a mindfulness teacher with the British School of Meditation. She's written this book on mindfulness at work and home. And I've heard her speaking on resolving conflict mindfully before. And so I just can't wait for you all to hear what she has to say. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to you, Gillian. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth and Teresa. I'm delighted to join you this afternoon, and thanks everybody for tuning in for this session. So as Ruth has indicated, I come to this subject wearing lots of different hats. So what I thought I would do, I mean, really conflict is my home ground. So as mother to now 11-year-old daughter, mediator, barrister, mindfulness teacher, it's where I dwell, it's where I spend a lot of time dealing with conflict. And it's really, I became interested in how we could perhaps positively use our mindfulness practice to either fight less, fight better, fight differently, deal with conflict in a way that could perhaps be more positive than our normal approach, where often we get stuck and we come to conflict with our own preconceived ideas. So, of course, I'm going to speak today with the backdrop of the pandemic, where many of us have seen our workplaces and home places collide and collapse. We may have been away from our colleagues, but too close to our family in search of private space, which may have caused its own conflict. We have been dealing with conflict differently by necessity, because we have been holding meetings on Teams and Zooms. And I think in a sense as well, while they may be able to convey a moody temperament or a difficult emotion, they are not the best forums, of course, for resolving conflict. And they don't really even allow us to stage a proper full-blown walkout, should we want to do one. So we've had to deal with conflict differently. And having spent quite a lot of time reflecting on the mindfulness practice and also the world of mediation, I want to share with you in the next half an hour just 7 short observations about the difference that I think mindfulness can make. So we're going to go on a little whistle-stop tour. I say at the start that I don't think any of this will be particularly new. But what I've done is try and draw the threads together of what we do and what we practice with our mindfulness and how that can impact the way we are in conflict. So most of these relate to conflict with other people, but one of the examples I'm going to draw on is also the conflict we have with ourselves. So the first notion, or the first observation I want to share with you, is this notion that, of course, our mindfulness encourages us perhaps to approach conflict, as with other situations in life, with that notion of non-judgmentalism, which can sound paradoxical when we're talking about conflict. Because of course we have a view, we have a judgment, which is why we might be in conflict in the first place. And far be it for me to suggest that our practice invites us to roll over, accept maybe a form of false harmony. It doesn't, we know that. But in a sense, it reminds us, I think, that rather than lashing out or adopting perhaps a tone of dismissal or contempt, that when we are in conflict with our mindfulness, we always have that invitation open to consciously respond and to move from our knee-jerk to that breathe, pause, respond stance, which I have to say, from a personal point of view, no matter how long I've practiced, that remains a challenge, whether it be with colleagues, clients, or children. So that mindful pause, that essential space, that essential slither that can pass between what's happening and how we then engage, I think is capable, as sort of backstop position one, of helping us to engage with others in conflict. And I think it also invites us to consider whether we can engage in conflict from a more respectful stance, whether we can soften our own approach, whether we can come to it with openness, patience, and compassion. So that mindful pause, although it's just the first of the 7 observations, I think could probably be unpacked much further, because it offers us such a buffet of opportunity in how, with the best of ourselves, we can engage, if we can do so using that practice. Second observation comes from the world of mediation, but also mindfulness. And in mediation, we teach the power of active listening. So doing nothing else, truly tuning in. And of course, this mirrors our mindful listening approach. A lot of research has shown that I think it's almost 90%, misunderstanding rather, is the cause of 90% of conflict. And most of us would probably admit that we find it quite tricky to listen fully, to put aside the demands of multitasking, to truly tune in. I from speaking for myself, not cutting people off, not finishing their sentences, not making assumptions of what I think the person is going to say is a challenge. But this act of mindful listening, where essentially that's all we do, and we tune in with the body language, with what is really presenting itself before us, I think can be immensely productive. Many of you may already be aware of Albert Mehrabian's rule of personal communication, where his research showed that only 7% of how we communicate is done through language. 38% is use of tone, intonation, our voice, our volume, and a massive 55% is in our body language. So again, being able to expand that notion of mindful listening and to become truly aware of how we're doing it, I think can offer quite a lot in terms of how we engage in conflict. That notion also of just simply changing our tone probably saves me daily, even with my daughter. Those of you who do have children will know how quickly they pick up on your tone. And if my tone has started badly or angrily or shoutily, if I'm on it, if I'm mindful, if I'm in the right place, I can probably tweak it so that she even sometimes flashes me a look as if to say, oh, we're back on board, everything's okay. So that power of even the change of intonation of tone, I think, is something that with our mindfulness practice, we're invited to consider. The third observation I want to share is this discovery that I think mindfulness has a massive potential impact on helping us to repair the consequences of conflict. So when it all goes sideways, upside down, wrong, out the window, our mindfulness invites us to consider for ourselves our own bringing to the conflict, if you like, our own attachment to the emotions that may have come central stage within the conflict, our ability to be kind to ourselves, to welcome everything, to lean in, to maybe offer that apology if that's appropriate, or to see where our own attribution of or contribution may be. So I think for the growing of our self-awareness and our awareness of our own behavior, where we have overstepped the mark or fueled the conflict, it also has something to say about that. And for my own experience, it's mindfulness has had a massive impact on my ability to step in and repair rather than sort of end up in a corner sulking or wondering where to go next because I've boxed myself in. So that's the third observation, this notion of repair, which I think is a really powerful one. The fourth observation is one that I want to mention because it really deals with the conflict that we have with ourselves. So drawing here on the inner critical voice, which we're all familiar with, and I want to bring in perfectionism, which I see as a strand of the inner critical voice. So I think most of us would probably admit that we have some degree or volume of inner critical voice going on, which often comes from our background, our learning, how we've been treated, our own self-esteem. And on top of that, dealing with that, this notion of perfectionism, which many of us struggle with. So Brené Brown, a shame researcher in the US, I think really powerfully describes perfectionism as a 20-ton shield that we carry around with ourselves, hoping that it's going to protect us. But actually, all it does is prevent us from truly being seen. So this notion that perfectionism is all about what will others think of me? What will they make of what I'm doing? In contrast to what she calls this healthy striving, where that's really to do with our own desire to do something well and is internally driven. So when these voices start to rise and the volume increases and our own conflict gets going, which can be, I think, at any moment of any particular decent fine day, those voices can come, the tone can change internally, and we have the capacity to really drag ourselves down. We have the capacity to, in the barrister's terms, hoist ourselves by our own petard, really get ourselves hijacked, strapped in a bad place. And of course, the invitation from mindfulness is firstly that it helps us to recognize, there's my tricky self-critical voice about not being good enough, expert enough, whatever it might be, good enough mother, good enough partner. So we hear the voice and we have that powerful understanding that, of course, the voices that we have are not facts that need definers. So for our own internal conflict purposes, our mindfulness, again, has something to say, and also bringing in that notion of self-compassion. How can we be kind to ourselves when we're really dealing with our own turmoils, even before we get started with somebody else? So again, powerful stuff from the field of mindfulness. The fifth observation is coming from the world of mediation, but it also comes actually from the world of meditation and mindfulness. And it's really this. Mediators are often taught to be what's called soft on the people and hard on the issues when dealing with conflict. So soft on the people, but hard on the issues. And when we, with our mindfulness, start to really zone in, mindfully, of course, on growing that self-awareness, we start to maybe be able to bring that approach to our conflict, because that question poses the following sub-questions. It asks us to consider, where is the other person coming from in this conflict? What are their values? How easy or not is it for them to articulate them? Is shame a factor? Is fear a factor? Is vulnerability a factor? What are their interests? Are they prone to taking things personally? Am I? The answer is yes. Again, can we be soft on the people and where they're coming from? So giving them the compassion as well as ourselves. So really tied in, as many of these points are, with that central notion of growing our self-awareness, which I think changes the way we engage in conflict on a good day with a fair wind. You know, I never promise that my mindfulness practice resolves everything, but if it helps 10%, then it's a good day. And the sixth observation I want to share with you, again, is really linked to self-awareness, but it's about checking in with whether we are bringing certain behaviors to a conflict that are often considered by conflict specialists to be ones that we can or should avoid. And for this, I'm going to draw on a leading expert from the field of marriage and parenting relationships. And these are words from Dr. John Gottman, an American who's written over 40 books on the subject. I think he's American. He says the following: these are the behaviors that we should be avoiding. The first is criticism. So refraining from attacking when we're in conflict somebody else's character. Sounds straightforward and easy, but we often slip. The second is contempt. So throwing the insults or perhaps eye rolling when you're in conflict. And some of these may resonate. The third is stonewalling. So shutting down. And the fourth is defensiveness. So seeing yourself as the victim. And so thinking back to areas of conflict in my own life and thinking, how is it, first of all, reflecting on how do I engage in conflict? Do I exhibit those tendencies and those behaviors? And does my mindfulness practice, at the very least, help me to recognize or see what I'm doing? Often, for example, I can see that I'm being defensive, but I can't stop it. So I'll have the trigger, oh, mindfulness coming in, telling me, yeah, Jill, you know what you're doing here. This is defensive. You know what you're doing. And you're criticizing, and you're berating, and you're doing all sorts of things. And I may first trigger have the awareness, that's what I'm doing. Second, I may be able to stop some of it, maybe a little bit. Third, if I can't, I may then have the ability to wade in and say, do you know what, I went too far, or whatever, I'm wading in with my apology step. But all of those, for me, come back as central points of a mindfulness practice. And that's why I think it's so powerful that there are so many facets of this practice that tap into how we approach shame, how we approach conflict, perfectionism, our inner critical voice. It has something to say on all these aspects that can help to determine whether we have a positive day or a really tricky day. And there's always growth and room for us to come back and start again, which is the beauty of what we know is, of course, a practice. And the seventh, last observation I want to share with you, before drawing on some really wise words at the end from Pema Chodron, is all about actually when we're in conflict, The self-awareness that we're growing invites us, I would suggest, to consider whether we are setting appropriate boundaries and whether we need to gently reinforce them. So this notion of what is okay with me in conflict and what is not. When am I going to engage, if I am going to engage, and how? When have my boundaries been exceeded and I'm just going to either withdraw or deal with this in a very different way by either de-escalating it or really escalating it, depending on what I consciously, responsively, in a considered manner think is best. Now, obviously, this is out with the heat of the moment, but these are some of the things I think we are compelled to consider if we are looking at conflict through the mindfulness lens. So the setting of appropriate boundaries, I think, also involves having the courage to be kind to ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. So to again bring in this fundamental concept of self-compassion. Sometimes, of course, in a conflict, the best thing I can do is simply walk out of the room, whether I'm displaying one of John Gottman's behaviors or not. You know, often when patience is short, the day has been long, I have not been able to effectively fill my own tank without guilt, which I think is also key, then there's not a lot left for me to give, and the risk of conflict or engaging in it really ratchets up. I'm going to draw again here on one of my personal heroines, Brené Brown, and she has something interesting to say about this point about boundaries. And her advice is to choose discomfort over resentment. So this notion of, you might feel a bit of discomfort if you say no, or you turn something down, maybe as a result of conflict, but that's always better than having said yes or making a concession that you then resent. So I think it brings in this notion of self-care, but also a little bit of perhaps bravery, courage when we engage. And from my experience, even from the world of, say, commercial mediation, even the driest of conflicts, or the appearance of a very dry conflict, there's often the reality of quite a lot of emotion underneath, even if it is at first not apparent. And so to acknowledge and to see clearly what the conflict is actually about becomes key, because that's what we're really doing. We're trying to engage in a way where we're bringing perhaps more of our responsive and less of our knee-jerk reactive self. So that's what mindfulness on a good day does for me. I want to share with you, before I open up questions, some words from Pema Chodron, who talks about chaos and conflict. And I love this notion of the welcome everything. The chaos is not to be avoided, effectively. And she says the following: chaos is part of our home ground. Instead of looking for something higher or purer, work with it just as it is. In every moment of time, we make a choice. Which way do we go? How do we relate to the raw material of our existence? First, we can train in letting the storylines go. Slow down enough to just be present. Let go of the multitude of judgments and schemes, and stop struggling. So while we may not be able to end our conflict, what we bring to it can actually, I think, change the result. Thank you for listening. And those are my 7 observations for today's session. Thanks so much, Ruth.
Thank you, Gillian. That was just wonderful. And I don't know about everybody else, but as you were talking, I sort of could feel some of these conflicts in my mind, you know, being relived, like these situations that you've had with people, particularly in a workplace context, where you think, oh yeah, my mindfulness would have been so helpful there if I'd kind of approach that in a slightly more mindful way, or even before I had mindfulness and I discovered that it could be helpful. So we're going to open up to questions. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand and I'll come to you. But I'm going to kind of selfishly jump in with a few of my own while people are thinking about what they'd like to ask. Gillian, I guess my first one is, you say in your book that conflict is an innate and vital part of life, love. And I love the fact that when you talk about conflict, it's very practical. And we're not denying the fact that conflict exists and it's there. It's a bit like with stress. And when people come to mindfulness for stress and they just say, I'd rather just not have stress. And I think we can take the same approach to conflict and just say, I'd rather not have conflict, thanks. That would be great. How would you, if you were sort of talking to somebody within a workplace conflict context, how would you almost sort of define conflict and say what it is? What is it that we're dealing with here when we're talking about conflict?
I think conflict, I love the idea that conflict is often a misunderstanding. It's often a mismatch of values. It's often a mismatch of assumptions. So I see it as a talking past each other. And I think from my mediation experience, even in the deepest of conflict, where people seem to be poles apart, there is often, and it may not be an obvious middle ground. It may not be a middle ground. It may be a very much to one side rather than to the other, but it becomes acceptable. And I think this notion of what is acceptable in conflict is a really important one. That it may not be, your resolution may not be how you imagine it, or you may not get your 100% or 90%. But if you get your 10% that is truly valuable and fits with your own value system, then that might be enough. So for me, it's very much a miscommunication and a mismatch of where, as individuals, we are coming from, and maybe what is not being heard and what I feel is not being seen if I'm in conflict. So there's part of me that you're not seeing. And maybe we're coming to this also with assumptions, which we can get really stuck in. I mean, for some people, they don't have to open their mouths on a non-mindful day in my world. And I know what they're going to say, right? So it's that breaking down the assumptions and the truly being heard and listened to that I think can then resolve that conflict often.
Yeah. And it's not necessarily about agreeing, is it?
No.
Working with kind of our politicians have said, mindfulness helps us to disagree better.
Yeah.
It's not about saying mindfulness just helps us all agree and we all come to the same place.
Yes, absolutely. And that notion of, as I said in the beginning, fighting better. I'm not advocating we're going to stop fighting, however we like to think of fighting or discussing or conflicting. We are going to, but it's how and what we bring to it. And whether we can bring our better selves on a good day, rather than just turning up and getting stuck in a habit-driven way, which we all have.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess within a workplace context, what would you say to somebody who is quite skeptical about mindfulness, and thinks that potentially, and I know I had this before I started practicing, it might turn you into a slightly insipid person who approaches conflict in a mindful way, but by that they mean, kind of avoiding conflict, shutting down or just pausing so that you don't actually have to kind of engage in the disagreement that might be the basis of the conflict. What would you say?
I think this whole notion of people being quite skeptical. So when I started the practice and was taking it to the bar, I spent months and months worrying about whether I would be considered as a sort of rollover barrister who was a bit pathetic and weak, and she's lost her edge and don't instruct her. And I was dealing with some very hard-hitting, difficult trials. And I was really worried about that, actually, how I would be perceived in my practice. And I think the power of it is simply sharing that we're tuning in with something that we all innately have, which is this ability to tune in and be in the present moment. And we are growing our self-awareness and we're learning to befriend the mind effectively. So there's nothing woo-woo about this. This is tuning in to moments of stillness, moments of calm. And I always say that it has undoubtedly made me a better listener, a more efficient lawyer. I think, you know, it doesn't radically 100% give you an overhaul, but it gives you tools within a toolbox to be able to deploy for different things. So that ability, if you say to people, look, it might be able to help you focus better, might be able to help you know when you're stressed or feel when your critical voice comes in. If you start talking about the practical changes that mindfulness can bring, that's where the power lies. So the benefits over time with practice. That's where I think the magic of mindfulness is in its daily application.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Mel, I can see that you've got a question.
Yes, just really interested, Gillian, when you spoke about sometimes the right thing to do is just walk away. And when you do that, are you doing that with the intention of coming back to this? Or are you doing that with the intention of, I just need to let this rest? Or a bit of both?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Mel. And sometimes, you know, I think the answer is both, depending on the situation. Sometimes we do just need to walk away. We're at such loggerheads. I'm not going to be able to come back, at least with the mindset that I may have entered into the fray with. And maybe that pause isn't going to come by me staying in the room. I may have to leave the room to actually calm my system down, engage the parasympathetic nervous part, and then be able to breathe and to respond. Because we can't often do that. It's all very well me sat here saying, actually, just breathe, pause, respond. It's easier said than done. These are difficult things, even when we practice. So I would say a bit of both. Sometimes to come back, sometimes not, to just not engage.
And are you actually stepping out of it with a mindful presence? So you're stepping out of this saying, we're not going to resolve this right now. We need to give this some space. How do you actually approach that exit, I guess?
Yeah, I think, again, slightly in context, and more difficult now, of course, virtually, in a way, I think, because I can't read the body language as I would be able to. Sure. I can't read how my tone of voice is being perceived. So on a good day, it would be, let's give this a moment, let's pause, let's reflect on what we've each said, what we've each brought to this. We don't agree. Let's give it a break and come back and resume. Or it might be, we don't agree. Maybe I might even in a work situation involve a third person. I work a lot with teams. So it may be that two of us don't agree and actually I need to just think, consult, consider, and think beyond my own assumption of what I'm dealing with that particular individual. Because he and I, or she and I, may have a history, of course, as well. And I may be quite staid in my ability to consciously respond, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It's almost that history of, well, it was this way last time, so it's going to be like that again almost, isn't it? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
thank you
for asking.
Thank you, Mel. So I've got questions coming through. I've got Tessa, Robert and Elizabeth. So I'm going to go in that order if that's okay. So Tessa, if you could ask your question of Gillian.
Thank you. Jill, that was fabulous talk. I've written so many notes. Found that really, really insightful about how you apply it in practice. And what is I'm really interested in is, as a woman, and there are obviously a vast majority on this call are women, how do you think conflict is different in men and women? Because I just feel that I can be quite passive aggressive. So I will try and avoid the conflict, be passive, then finally I'll snap and I'll be quite aggressive, not very skillful. I just was interested in your observations about any differences gender-wise.
Yeah, and Tessa, I inhabit still quite especially in my particular world, quite a male-dominated environment, male-dominated teams. I think in the past I have been a lot more aggressive and found that I've had to be, I think looking back, I've been quite aggressive about my conflict. I have waded in because I felt that was something I needed to do to be heard. Because I'm only generalizing, of course, so forgive me, but I think the mindfulness has convinced me that I have a power beyond my aggression. So actually, when I'm really going to be listened to is particularly when you speak slower, when you speak perhaps in a way that you feel you have considered yourself, so you're bringing your own gravitas and authority to it, on subjects that you have spent time, these are not knee-jerk, these are conscious decisions. And often I've had to almost explain that this is something that I have mulled over for the last few days or weeks. And I think maybe we are more as women. I know, at least if I talk about breaking down how I would analyze how I got on in a particular trial, my experience is that women tend to really sort of ruminate and think, oh, but what if I'd have done that? And if I'd have done that, I could have got him off, or he might not have been found guilty, or if my speech had been better. In a barrister's chambers, I've had a lot more ruminating conversations about, oh, how could we have dealt with this? And it's my fault, than I've had with men. That's just fact, who have not largely been ruminating perhaps as much as I have. So I always have to try and overcome my rumination and then think, actually, what do I consciously and contemplatively bring to this? So I think to recognize the power of what we bring once we have had that ability to sit back and think about the conflict. So to that responsiveness is actually quite powerful. Does that make any sense, Tessa?
Yeah, that's really useful. And I what you say about speaking quite slowly and the pace and the tone, that's really impactful, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
Thank you, Tessa. Robert, could we come to your question next, please, and then we'll do Elizabeth. And please keep sending the questions through.
Hi, Gillian.
Hi, Robert.
I've been thinking a lot about the political culture in the US and Canada and the UK and the rise of bullying everywhere.
Yeah.
And there's obviously conflict there. And my question is, how does one deal with bullies who don't have the same agenda that you do of actually trying to resolve the conflict, but simply of winning?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Partly, I think partly my response to you, Robert, is really about staying true to who you are in that conflict if you're dealing with a bully. So I'm never going to change the bully's, I'm probably never going to change the bully's view. But if I'm engaging with that person, or I'm acting on behalf of a minor who is subject to that behavior, so say, for example, my daughter, it's the same sort of principle in a way. How do I stay true to who I am and deal with somebody who is exhibiting the bullying behavior? And my way of doing it has really been to that sense of authenticity about myself, not bending, and trying to communicate what I believe is right or how a situation should be resolved, whether that's through a colleague, a teacher who needs to deal with the situation, a senior. So for me, in the situations in which I've dealt with it, which have been numerous, I have probably without fail still called it all out. I've had really, really difficult moments where I can think of one in particular where it almost came to physical blows and somebody walked in through the door. And it was myself and a man. Not the blow didn't come from me, but it was about to happen. And somebody came through the door. And for me, it has always been about, notwithstanding whether I'm going to change your behavior, I'm going to dig into what I authentically believe, and I'm going to call this out, whether it's popular, whether I'm right, whether I will be sacked, or whatever. So that has been my personal stance, Robert. I'm not sure it works for everybody, but my practice calls on me to consider how I authentically respond. Does that make any sense?
It does. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Jill. Elizabeth, can I come to you, please?
Hi, Ruth.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Gillian. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, just picking up a little bit on what Ruth said right at the beginning of the Q&A, which is the definition of conflict. And, you know, I don't personally think that all conflict is bad. I mean, depending on how you frame it. Because if it, in my view, in my humble opinion, that it could almost be on a continuum. Because by the time you get to conflict, which for me is a big word, and it already makes my stomach feel all knotted up with that word, conflict. Whereas you may sort of reframe it as a difference of opinion, which may have gotten a little bit out of hand, but by the time you get to conflict, for me, it sounds like, oh, we're at war now. The conflict zone. It's right against wrong. It's, you know, it's that clash of views. Whereas perhaps in my mind, if I think of it more as a difference of opinion, there's more room to perhaps find that middle ground. This is probably more of a conflict. This is more of a comment. I read the East Bay Meditation Center's rules of engagement. You know, when you go into a meeting or when you're sharing, that one of the things that's very helpful is to replace the word but with the word and. So I've started to use this. I came across the East Bay Meditation Center rules of engagement in a sort of Buddhist setting, if you like. But I've taken it away with me, and it's helped me so much. It's because but is already like, you're butting heads there. And whereas if we use the word and, it's more of a continuation of that discussion as opposed to like breaking up the discussion or the arguments or whatever into a conflictual space. And when you spoke of tone, it reminded me of Margaret Thatcher, who famously was tutored on bringing her voice down a couple of octaves from the very shrill voice that she started with. And when you look at the archive documents, you see that, you know, she went down a peg or two, her voice, and it was much more mellow and more people were much more receptive to her. I mean, regardless of what her policies were, I'm not not by any means saying that what she said was correct, but certainly the way she said it changed. And men in particular were much more willing to listen to her because she didn't sound like a fishwife, you know, a couple of years into her premiership. So there were just a couple of comments.
Yes.
Yeah, but yeah,
fascinating, Elizabeth. And I think what you've given us is an example of what I would call the giving space language. So we're not closing down, we're allowing that the and rather than the but. Michael Parkinson, an interviewer who interviewed lots of celebrities in the 70s, 80s, 90s, he always used to use the tell me more, tell me more. So to engage and to ask and to invite. And similarly with children, when we were going through the adoption process, one of the phrases that they would talk to us about was when you're talking to your child, rather than labeling how they are or how you perceive their feelings or their emotions, it's to use the phrase, I'm wondering, or I'm just wondering whether, and then you finish your sentence, and it's good with adults as with children. But this notion of giving space language, so that the conflict doesn't build and get out of hand, but as you say, it might be more of a way of influencing each other's opinions or differences of opinion, which may be in conflict, but not at a high level. So how do we, again, effectively communicate is what we're talking about there, I think, and actually convey our ideas without getting to a position of loggerhead. Yeah, thanks very much, Elizabeth. Fascinating.
Thank you, both. I have a question from Tanya and then from Martin. So Tanya, can I come to you first? Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I can't turn my camera on and my voice is booming out from the blackness. My question is about the scenario is if you have a family member or a good friend who believes in the conspiracy theories that are going around at the moment, and they won't agree just to disagree, and they won't agree to not talk about it, and also you feel behind your stance is that you're worried about them, where this is going to go and how it's affecting their actions and whether it's to do with their mental health. So there's like a layer of feeling triggered because you think they're talking, you know, it's very dangerous what they're talking about, and you're also worried about them, and they want to convert you to their opinion, and I don't seem satisfied with finding some equanimity of like, well, you think this and I think that, let's still have a relationship together. Have you got any advice on how you would deal with that? Or
yeah, I've got some thoughts. So it's not the same, but I think there are different, it's almost a gradient, it's almost a scale. So we will all have either a friend or a family member, I think, who is exhibiting views similar or akin to those you are describing. In relation to a friend, I have a friend who lives abroad. We disagree on vaccination. She refuses. I am very much in support of the vaccination programme. And to just keep it brief, at the moment, I had to communicate the view to her, having dealt with the COVID situation in my own home and in my own life, that I did not wish to discuss it with her. I needed space. I was not in a space to communicate with her at the moment about it, and that we would talk again perhaps in a few months' time. That's easier to do and to deal with because I'm not concerned about her mental health. But I had to give myself some space to be able to consider how I authentically respond. And that was my response. I'm not in a place where I can, I think, speak rationally, kindly, openly with her. So I'm going to refrain at the moment until I feel I can. With someone who we are concerned with their mental health, the words that arise for me as you spoke are really, well, firstly, we're not going to change their opinion. So for me, it's about kindness, support, space, presence. So it's about being there and still, for particularly a family member or close friend, that you're not cutting ties and moving into a space of not convincing me or me convincing you, but that it goes deeper, that you maintain your presence and your openness, so that those concerns about mental health, there's still a channel on which there is a way of communicating. Now, others may disagree with me, but for mental health issues, which can be utterly unpredictable, and again, I speak from some experience, for me, I think it's that ability to maintain or uphold some channel of communication, even when you fundamentally disagree about the subject matter. Yeah.
Thank you, Gillian.
Thank you, thanks.
Thank you, Tanya. Martin, can I come to you?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Gillian.
Hi, Martin.
For your authenticity and also your humility. It's kind of really lovely to hear someone talking around conflict and saying this is the reality, and on a good day I might be able to work with things and so on. So my question is around when emotions are very high in conflict situations, and I suppose particularly it could be at home, could be at work. I'm thinking more about a workplace situation. I'm just wondering, you know, how that's navigated. Often high emotions are seen as quite a toxic or something that's dangerous in a workplace. So I'm quite curious as to how you can kind of move into this space of exploring assumptions, bringing curiosity, your answer to Elizabeth's question around bringing spaciousness and so on. So I just wondered if there's any thoughts around that, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so emotions running high. I think this is more common than most workplaces would admit, to be frank. And often emotions running high, what's behind them is often hidden. At the bar, there are still lots of problems associated with shame in being open about what is driving those high emotions. So whether it's inability to cope with work, too much work, alcohol, drugs, whatever it might be, there's a lot of shame that's still associated. So what you might see is a peak of emotion, but what you may never really see is what's, of course, driving this. It may not be the work project that you have set, but it might be the 101 other things behind the scenes that you're never going to be told about. And I think that's a really difficult challenge, because we don't yet work in environments where, okay, we might talk about mindfulness. We might have somebody come in and give a talk about it to our colleagues. We might even do an 8-week course. But whether we truly embrace as a work culture and as a functioning work environment, the ability to create safe spaces, which is really what we're talking about, I think, to come and talk to somebody who may be designated a well-being officer. I think the title is pretty scary, actually. I'm one. And I, again, it's on a serious note, though, it's about that safe space, the title, the person, the front. Are they approachable? Could you come and talk to somebody? Is there enough confidentiality within the workplace? Or are you going to be seen going in, talking to X or Y? Do you work in a culture which invites that openness to speak? And I think most work cultures are not there. And I think we've faced even more isolation, of course, with the pandemic, where we've all been thrust homeward bound without the ability to have that heartfelt conversation in a room with a human being and have some human contact. I shouted at an energy supplier yesterday because they didn't bother to ring me. They just emailed me, and I actually wanted to chat. But there's a serious point here, because it's about the creation of safe space and the eradication of shame and the talking about the messy business of being human. And this sense of let's be real here, let's cut to the chase, and let it not be something that undermines or threatens your job. So if you come to me talking about a certain issue, am I likely to take a view on you? There's fear, I think. So I don't really have an answer, but my concern is that we create environments where there are spaces where we are truly free to talk and share and give guidance and comfort to one another. And to exercise that compassion, Martin, that I spoke about. And, you talk about self-compassion at the bar. If I stand up and talk about self-compassion, that's a really tricky thing to do, because self-care, wow, that sounds weak. And it's not until you unpack the very, very credible research in this area and talk about the scientific benefits, which again is a way in, that people start to sit back and think there's something in this. So there's a long way to go, I'm afraid. Long answer, sorry, Martin.
No, psychological
really
safety work though, and I love that, setting the mindfulness within the context. Mindfulness is not just a sticking plaster that you're going to be able to put up with conflict and say, there we go, we've got a conflict resolved, we've got mindfulness as the answer. It needs to be a whole framework around it. So on that note, just because we're coming up to 1:30, I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Gillian. I mean, I always find this session absolutely fascinating, and what you have to say on conflict, particularly with all of your experience within the world of conflict. So thank you very much to everybody else for your questions. If you aren't a member of the Mindful Workplace community but would like to join, please do consider becoming a member, and then you'll get access to even more fascinating webinars like this. Teresa will put the links in the chat, and there'll be a follow-up email. But if you want to run away and join straight away, Teresa will put the chat in there for you. So thank you, everybody. Have a great conflict-free afternoon, if that's what you desire. And we will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Ruth. Thank you, Teresa.
Really good.
Really
Thank you
good.
very
Thanks.
much, Gillian. Amazing. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take
Bye,
care.
everybody.
Bye.